Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today, before we get into the video, I would just like to announce that I have made a Twitter account where I'll be discussing things like small comments on certain Sharks news, as well as live tweeting during Sharks games. So if those things are of any interest to you, consider following me at ProfHockeyYT on Twitter. A link will be in the description below. But moving into the actual meat and potatoes of this video, it is the Sharks 21-22 season preview. Over a month ago, almost 2 months ago at this point, I created a video of an early lineup prediction for this upcoming season, and a few things have changed since then. For one, there is a bit more clarity on the Evander Kane situation. Before, in that previous video, I was pretty sure he wouldn't end up playing with the Sharks this season. Now I'm a bit less sure about that. It kind of seems almost like 50-50 at this point. And so I've actually come up with two separate lineup cases, with him in the lineup and with him out of the lineup. There were also the development camp as well as rookie tournaments to help evaluate how close and how far certain younger players actually were to being able to make it to the NHL lineup this season. But before I get into the lineups, I do actually want to discuss the Sharks' position in the Pacific Division, because there is a return to normalcy this season. Last year, the Sharks were put in this kind of weird West division where all the Canadian teams ended up moving into a Canadian division, so no Vancouver, no Edmonton, no Calgary, and the Sharks were joined by teams like Colorado and Minnesota. But now they are moving back into the very normal Pacific Division, where they actually stand a pretty decent chance of making the playoffs. If we take a look at each of these teams, right at the top is of course the Vegas Golden Knights. They are far and away, it seems, the best team in this Pacific Division, but after that first place Golden Knights, it seems like a massive drop off, where at second place we might have the Edmonton Oilers, and the Oilers are not even that great of a team, and yet it seems as though they might end up being the second best team of this division. Same with the Calgary Flames and the Vancouver Canucks. Neither of those two teams, I would consider them world beaters, but they might actually end up being competitive for a playoff spot, because again, the rest of the division isn't particularly good. The Seattle Kraken are actually a new arrival in this division. They're kicking out the Arizona Coyotes, who are moving over to the Central Division to come in, and while the Seattle Kraken could have a legendary inaugural season like the Vegas Golden Knights did a few years ago, it is also very possible that the Seattle Kraken come out of the gate very slowly and end up being a bottom feeder team here at the NHL level. And then when it comes to the other two California teams in the NHL, the Anaheim Ducks and the Los Angeles Kings, both of these teams have very young and very talented players who could end up taking enough steps forward this season to make them contenders to make the playoffs. But it's also very possible that the rebuild can continue in Anaheim and Los Angeles, and they end up being pretty bad teams like they have been these past few seasons. And so when it comes to the Sharks' position in the Pacific Division standings, I honestly can see them finishing anywhere from 8th place, last in the division, a top 5 draft pick, all the way up to potentially competing for a wild card, if not even being 3rd place in the Pacific Division, depending on how the teams around them do. That's how weak the Pacific Division currently looks to be going into this season. So moving into the lineups, I will discuss first the Evander Kane featured lineups. First line, I have Kane, Hertl, and Barabanov. This was obviously the line that was put together at the end of last season that was so successful, so I can definitely see that come, game one. I should note that this lineup is what I am predicting to have game one of the regular season, and I'm making this video specifically before the training camp and preseason to make it somewhat more interesting, because obviously new information will arrive over these next week and a half, 2 weeks prior to the start of the season, where the lineups may become a bit more clear. That's why I'm actually making the video specifically right before the start of the preseason, which actually comes later today. So that first line of Kane, Hertl, Barabanov, hopefully it can actually continue its production, because if Kane does indeed play and Barabanov actually ends up looking like he did at the end of last season, the Sharks wouldn't even have all that bad of a top 6, which has been a major problem for the Sharks over these past couple of seasons since the departure of Joe Pavelski in the 18-19 off-season. As a second line, I have Couture, Meyer, and Lebank. This is kind of an odd second line because all three of these players were quite disappointing this past season. Neither of them were up to standard, so if all three of them actually end up rebounding, this could be a very, very effective second line at the NHL level. But of course, if all three of these players end up kind of kind of staying stagnant with where they were last season, well, maybe the top 6 for the Sharks won't actually be all that good. Moving on to the third line, this has actually been bolstered significantly with the addition of Nick Bonino in this offseason. I have him here currently paired with Rudolf Balcers, as well as Jonathan Dahlen. This is my sort of bold prediction, I guess you could say. He is a younger player who I think could potentially be given an opportunity here on this third line, even though he's not necessarily the most responsible and well-rounded player. He does have an offensive upside to him, and it will be well shielded by the surprisingly solid defensive game of Rudolf Balcers and the very solid two-way game that Nick Bonino brings to the Sharks, and the reason why he actually ended up being signed this past offseason. And Bonino, he brings that defensive game, but he's also no slouch offensively, right? The play does not necessarily die on his stick. He can make a pretty solid offensive third line. So I think Bonino, Balcers, and if Dahlen can actually work out, can be a good situation. But the reason I have Dahlen in red, as well as the entire fourth line in red, is because all of these players are very much interchangeable. The main thing here being is that all of these players could end up being moved out of the lineup, even if they're not actually injured, just because I think the Sharks will be doing a lot of movement here in this bottom 6. The only 2 players in the bottom 6 currently that I have as kind of untouchable would be, in my eyes, Balcers and Bonino. For a fourth line coming to game 1 of the regular season, I suspect the Sharks will want to go with some relative safety, just to go with some, some known names that have some decent defensive play, which is why I have the fourth line being consisted of Nieto, Cogliano, and Dylan Gambrell. None of these players are world beaters. They're half decent offensively, at least when it comes to Nieto and Gambrell. Cogliano, not so much, but they all bring a certain level of defensiveness that the Sharks would probably like and enjoy the stability of for game 1 of the regular season. This is not a fourth line that you're going to be playing against other teams' first lines to try and nullify them, but this is a fourth line that when you're going against other teams' fourth lines, you're probably at the very least having an even matchup, if not a slight advantage. Moving on to the defensive pairs, this is all very, very sort of basic. I would say Burns and Ferraro, Carlson and Kenijev, as were the pairings last year, as well as Shemek and Vlasic. The reason I have Shemek in red is twofold. One, Shemek was kind of on a downturn last season, so if that were to continue, then technically there is a world where Shemek ends up getting benched and another 6th defenseman comes into the lineup. But the major reason is I think it would make it more interesting to discuss if there are actual players who could come in as a 6th defenseman option over a player like Vadim Shemek, compared to just saying, well, this is a, stuck in stone top 6 defense for the Sharks, and nothing here is going to change barring any injury. And then for goaltending, I of course have Adin Hill and James Reimer. That I would say is pretty much just there and not really much going to change. When it comes to the Evander Kane lineup, basically the only change is that I've moved everyone on the left side up by 1. So instead of Evander Kane on that first line with Hurdle and Barabanov, I end up moving up Meyer there. I feel like Meyer is probably the player who is at least somewhat similar to Evander Kane in the way that both of those players play, and so it wouldn't be too much of a departure for that line. I then move up Balcers to play with Couture and Lebank. This was a pretty popular line that the Sharks used last season and was pretty good. I then moved up it was Matt Nieto to the third line to play with Dahlen as well as Nick Bonino. And then to the fourth line, I added in Noah Gregor. Of course, was a pretty solid player for the San Jose Sharks this past season, so why not put him on the fourth line? He also fits into that mold of, a solid-ish defensive player who can play on that fourth line and give some stability to the San Jose Sharks. But as I said, a lot of these names are in red because they can be swapped out, and here I have a list of potential forwards who can move into the lineup past that first game of the season and absolutely will be given some opportunities. And it should be noted that this is not an exhaustive list. The Sharks have so many forwards who can actually draw into the lineup that I couldn't even list them all here, but I listed probably the most prevalent ones at that. So first on the list we have John Leonard. Of course, he also played a ton of games, but he wasn't necessarily all that impressive here. I think most likely it depends, however, on how Jonathan Dahlen actually does throughout this preseason. If Dahlen does not actually impress all that much and ends up being sent down to the AHL for the start of the season, John Leonard is likely the most the most probable option to fill in that spot on that third line. But otherwise here, I have him as a list of someone who can draw into the lineup at some point, but may or may not actually end up playing that first game of the season. Next, I have Jasper Weatherby, who was extremely impressive during this rookie tournament that the Sharks had a couple of weeks ago, and he just signed an entry-level deal with the San Jose Sharks. He seems like a primed position to try and challenge for that fourth line center spot, considering, at least in my eyes, Dylan Gambrell is kind of on his last straw. If he's not remotely impressive, even just through the first few games of this season, I would be very willing to bench him in favor of Jasper Weatherby. I feel as though the Sharks have a bit more leeway with Gambrell. For whatever reason, they enjoyed him a bit more than I did this past season, but I do think Weatherby will get a good chunk of games just because of how impressive he was during that rookie tournament. At least we'll see how he does in the preseason to see if that can actually carry through. The next would be Lane Peterson. Was a very interesting pickup from the Arizona Coyotes. The Sharks seem to be specifically targeting him when they brought him over from the Arizona Coyotes, a player who was pretty good at the AHL level and was okay at the NHL level this past season, and he's definitely going to be someone who's going to be in and out of the fourth line. We'll see if he can actually make a name for himself. As I said, the Sharks definitely did want to bring him over to San Jose, and we'll see if they had good reason to want that to happen. The next would be Joachim Blichfeld, a very offensively based player, so not necessarily someone who I would say would make it to that fourth line to play with a player like Andrew Cogliano, because obviously that's more of a defensive-offensive clash. Blichfeld's major issue is that while he's been having success at the AHL, where he's been able to get more space, at the NHL level, he's always been quite shut down, because Blichfeld does have the tools to be an effective offensive player. He's got a great shot, he's got great moves, but the problem is he doesn't really have that ability to create space for himself. He seems to be a player who would succeed on a line that is driven by other players and not so much himself. So I suspect he will be given a few opportunities, but since those opportunities will continue to come in the bottom six, I just don't necessarily expect him to be able to excel in those very few opportunities he ends up being given, unless of course he takes a massive step forward this season. The next player who I suspect will get a few games this year would be Sasha Chmelevski. He was a player who did get a few games this past season, but really wasn't given much opportunities in those few games, was played very little time on ice. I actually thought Chmelevski wasn't all that bad in the very little time that he was given, but I do suspect that Bob Booner disagreed with me, considering he did not get many games at all. Hopefully Chmelevski is given a bit more of an opportunity this season, but with, of course, the logjam that there is in this bottom six, he's going to have to work very hard for that. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that will inspire him to really up his level so that not only I can appreciate him, but of course the coaching staff, which in the end is really the only thing that matters. And then finally, I have Jeff Viel here, was re-signed this past off-season to be that tough guy for the San Jose Sharks. And while I don't suspect that the Sharks actually need that, I do know that Booner does believe that the Sharks actually do need that. I mean, the fact that Curtis Gabriel, a player who was not particularly good offensively, not particularly good defensively, and could barely actually win the fight, which was his major calling card to make it to an NHL lineup, the fact that he actually played a handful of games this past season shows that the Sharks organization as a whole wants a tough guy in the lineup for, a decent chunk of games. So Viel is a bit better in all of those areas than Curtis Gabriel, so I suspect he will get at least, 15 or so games for this upcoming season. And finally, the last player on this list, William Eklund. I felt the need to include him in this situation. While all the previous players on that I have listed, I suspect will get at least a couple of games this season, Eklund is the one player who could end up playing this year, but definitely could end up just getting a full 0 NHL games for this upcoming season. It will heavily depend on how this preseason goes. He was not necessarily a player who was extremely impressive during the rookie tournament. Based solely on rookie tournament, I would end up playing him, overseas or in the AHL. But he could definitely impress during the preseason, playing with some better line mates, and so he may actually end up making the lineup, and I felt the need to include him here. When it comes to the defenseman, as I said, Shemek is not, his place in the lineup is not necessarily in danger, but it is an interesting exercise to consider who could be replacing him. Now, the major thing here is you'll notice I don't have players like Milosh or Jacob Middleton on this list. That's because I don't think any of those players are going to be taking massive steps forward, and I think Shemek, even in his sort of downturned self from the previous year, is always going to be a better option than those two. The real options who I have replacing Simek are players who are kind of on the upswing or could potentially be on the upswing, have the potential to be on the upswing, who could end up replacing Radim Simek. And first here I have Ryan Merkley. Obviously, the last 2 games of the rookie tournament make it seem that Merkley is still a ways away from being able to make it to the NHL and is not going to be able to do it this season. But I can't help but remember that first game of the rookie tournament against the Anaheim Ducks, where he was just so impressive, that where he actually looked like a player who absolutely could make it to the NHL. So we'll see over this preseason if we'll see Anaheim Ducks Ryan Merkley or if we'll see Colorado Avalanche and Vegas Golden Knights Ryan Merkley, because if we do see Anaheim Ducks Ryan Merkley on a consistent basis, maybe he does have a chance of replacing Radim Simek. On the other hand, Kenyasev is a player who, similar to Ryan Merkley, is more offensively based, but doesn't necessarily have the low lows that Ryan Merkley does, even if he also doesn't have the high highs. Kenijev was a player who originally I had predicted could play in a decent chunk of games for the San Jose Sharks in this upcoming season. The rookie tournament kind of was a downturn on that. I didn't necessarily believe it so much there, but again, if a preseason, event could happen and he performs exceptionally well, there's definitely an opportunity for him to draw into the lineup. And the third and final option is actually maybe a bit off board here, and that would be Santeri Hatakka, who in my eyes was very impressive through this rookie tournament. But the thing is that with the 2 previous options, Merkley and Kenyasev, this was a pretty steep departure from what Radim Simek brings to the lineup. Simek is definitely more of a defensive defenseman, while Ryan Merkley and Kenyasev were going to be options that were more offensively minded. And so it felt like as though those players would fit pretty well with Vlasic to, go under his wing, I guess you could say, even if Vlasic is not necessarily the most successful defensive defenseman in the NHL anymore. But when it comes to Hatakka, the reason he would end up being replaced over Simek is if he's just a better defensive defenseman than Radim Simek. And honestly, I could see this technically happening. It's going to be very difficult for Hatakka to stand out in a very, very positive way during the preseason, because it's a lot more difficult for these defensive defensemen to stick out compared to an offensive defenseman, where if you make a few good plays happen offensively, you really start to look really good. So it'll be difficult for Hatakka to actually be able to one up and replace Simek, but it's definitely not off the table, and I really have appreciated Hatakka's performance during the rookie tournament, and I honestly wouldn't be all that mad in seeing him in the lineup. It could end up being like a Nikolai Kenijev situation that we saw this past season. But that will do it for this season preview. The one thing is for sure here, with all the drama that the Sharks have in the lineup with Evander Kane, as well as all the possible options that the Sharks have in the lineup with that bottom 6, as well as the fact that the Pacific Division is completely wide open, this is going to be a very interesting season to watch for the San Jose Sharks. Class dismissed.